Alabama police have arrested 2 people in connection with a birthday party shooting that killed 4 people and wounded 32 over the weekend. Tyrick McCullough, 17 years old, and Travis McCullough, 16 years old, have been charged with 4 counts of reckless murder.
Police have identified the victims as 23-year-old Corbin DeMontre Holston, 19-year-old Marcia Emmanuel Collins, 18-year-old Philistavius Dowdell, and 17-year-old Shankiva Kiki Nicole Smith. They were shot and killed while attending a Sweet 16 birthday party shortly after 10:30 p.m. on Saturday night. Here's Alabama police speaking on the matter.
On Tuesday, April 18th, at approximately 8 p.m., Alabama law enforcement agencies, State Bureau of Investigation, officially arrested and charged Tyrick McCullough, 17, of Tuskegee, and Travis McCullough, 16, also of Tuskegee, with 4 counts of reckless murder each. That's 4 counts of reckless murder each.
So they did not specify a potential motive for the shooting yet. I take it from reading the coverage that the shooters were at the event
it's difficult.
already. It's kind of hard to tell.
It's hard to tell. It's a little odd. I know this is just breaking, and so we don't know.
I mean, it's breaking that they were arrested. Obviously, this did happen over the weekend.
Right. So I know that it's just breaking, so there's a reason why perhaps we don't have those details, but if they were at the event, it seems like that should be an obvious, like a very easy thing to figure out. But as for some background, it was one of the deceased sisters, Sweet 16, Alexis Dowdell. And she said she was looking forward to this. She had butterflies in her stomach. There was a rumor at the party that someone had a gun, at which point I believe their mother made an announcement over the speaker saying, if anyone here has a gun, you need to leave. We're here to celebrate a Sweet 16 party. And you know, they tried to figure out who it was. They didn't, and the party kept going. And then all of a sudden, while people were dancing on the dance floor, they heard gunfire. And Alexis says, "All I remember is my brother grabbing me and pushing me down to the ground. She fell into a puddle of blood. She got up and ran outside. Afterwards, she reunited with her mom, but she couldn't find her brother. And when the shooting stopped, they saw him and a lot of others, obviously, on the dance floor and blood." I mean, it just sounds like an absolutely horrific event. So I'm very eager to find out what the possible motive could be, why people at the party would start shooting in this way, shooting people that they know. And if it's not someone at the party, what their motives could have been to do something as horrific as this.
Right. These individuals in custody are being charged as adults. They're 16 and 17, so there'll be much steeper potential penalties there. You know, it's interesting how these things take shape in the public perception. There's not been protests about this, or even the calls for like gun control protests or protests about crime. This is a mass shooting. A number of people, 4 people dead, many others shot. That satisfies the criteria of a mass shooting. But I don't know that it's being characterized or discussed in the same way the school shootings we've talked about or the bank shooting from the other week are described. Do you see what I'm getting at?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know much about this case. I don't know much about whether there have been protests. I mean,
there's not been as much news coverage of it.
For example, there wasn't a protest over the woman who was killed turning around in the driveway, as far as I know. The protests around the first case with the 16-year-old who rang the doorbell and was shot was over whether or not the guy was going to be charged. There seemed to be some delay in charging and arresting the person who did the shooting. I think there was some concern because there have been a pattern of other cases where folks have not been charged. Remember, there was the D.C. case where the kid who was perceived to be at least trying to steal a car, was shot by a homeowner outside of the house and wasn't charged for quite some time. So I think that the protests tend to be not that something happened, but that there has been a failure in the justice system and actually pursuing the case. In this one, it looks like they caught people who were really suspects and are likely to charge them. They're charging them as adults.
Well, ultimately, there hasn't been a failure in the justice system with respect to the teenage boy shot, the doorbell shooting.
Well, now
so far.
the protests happened because the guy wasn't charged.
Right.
Those happened immediately in that gap period. I don't know if there have been subsequent protests, but absolutely, I think that there should be an attention to gun laws in this case. Absolutely, Alabama has one of the highest. We talked about this yesterday, how when we're talking about dangerous cities and dangerous states, there was this weird politicization where conservatives tend to want to say Democrats are hypocrites for having, urban cities with crime, when so many of the states and localities with the highest amount of gun violence are in fact in, not that this is should be about this, but in conservative states like Alabama, and cities in Alabama often rank very high on that list.
That's another reason I suspect the attention not as much paid to this was these were not AR-15s. They're not the guns that are as I've said on this show, as most gun crimes are, most violent crimes, most murders are committed by the much more common kind of gun, the handguns, not the really destructive weapons that everyone gets so incensed about that are responsible for a tiny fraction.
Yeah, and this story has been covered broadly. I'm looking at a Vox piece, BuzzFeed News, et cetera. It's worth noting, and people have been talking about this gun violence in the context of this case, noting that gun violence is the leading cause of death among Alabama children. I think what's interesting is that some people who are perhaps more right-leaning will often say things like, well, that statistic doesn't really matter. It's not a real statistic because it is cases like this, or cases that are perceived to be about internal disputes, gang violence, and that is not what some folks are really concerned about. I think a lot of members who live in communities where they're subject to this kind of violence are very much concerned about the proliferation of guns, and they're very much, I think, victimized by how easy it is to get a gun, particularly in red states.
Right. If anyone's saying it doesn't matter because of the particulars, that would be a bad thing to say. I guess what I'll suggest is that there's a specific, when there is a racism component to it, it can get a crime can get this is what we've seen happen, gets a national discussion and hearing that equally horrific or even crimes involving even more deaths don't get if there's not the racism component.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that can escalate a crime to a national prominence. Often it's been very much studied how if the victim of a crime, a murder, is white, blonde woman, they get a lot more coverage, even though most missing children in the United States are not white, blonde women. So there's a lot of ways in which bias or a sense of salaciousness or what the public appetite is for drives news coverage. And sometimes that means that black victims of crime are ignored in favor of white victims of crime. Sometimes it means that white perpetrators of crimes might be focused on more than others. And I think it's worth having a robust conversation about why that is, for sure.
Well, we'll have more Rising right after this.